Hello, welcome to GP Podcast. Something just happened up in low Earth orbit. A signal was sent. But this wasn't a distress call or some routine satellite update. No, this was a message from a new kind of intelligence, one that's waking up in the cold, silent void of space. And what it said, well, it might just change everything.
So what did it say? Greetings, Earthlings. Yeah, I know. It sounds like something straight out of a cheesy old sci-fi movie, right? But here's the thing. This wasn't fiction. This was real. This was the very first response from a high-performance AI that was queried live while it was whipping around our planet at over 17,000 miles per hour. A new era has absolutely begun.
Okay, so let's break down what actually happened up there. The mission was called StarCloud 1, and what they did was they took one of the most powerful AI chips on the planet, an NVIDIA H100, and blasted it into orbit on a SpaceX Falcon 9. Now, the big deal here, the real game changer, wasn't just that they got the chip to work in space. No, the breakthrough is that this was the very first time a complex AI was actually trained in orbit. It learned from scratch, right there in the vacuum of space. They even followed it up with a live test using Google's Gemma model, just to really drive the point home.
So how did they even test this? Well, they started small. They took a model called NanoGPT and fed it the complete works of Shakespeare. Now, the goal wasn't to get a sonnet-writing AI, It was about asking a really fundamental question. Can an AI even learn something as complex as language, all the grammar, the structure, the meaning, when it's not in a nice, stable lab on Earth? And the answer came back a resounding yes. The model learned. It proved that the fundamental process of AI learning doesn't just fall apart once you leave the planet. Which, of course, brings up the million-dollar question, or maybe the billion-dollar question. Why? Why go through all this trouble, all this expense, just to train an AI in orbit? It seems crazy, right? Well, the answer, and this is kind of ironic, has nothing to do with space and everything to do with the limits we're hitting right here on Earth.
Look, when you move this whole operation to space, you're not just changing the location, you're completely changing the rules of the game. Down here on Earth, we're hitting a wall, a hard wall. AI data centers are unbelievably hungry for power, for land, and for water to keep them cool. But in space, you've got 30% stronger sunlight 24/7. You've got the perfect free coolant, the vacuum of space itself. And guess what you don't have? Zoning fights, water rights battles. The hardware is ready to go to the next level. But our planet is literally becoming the bottleneck.
And this isn't some far-off problem either. It's accelerating, fast. The International Energy Agency is projecting that the amount of electricity these data centers use is set to more than double by 2030. Just think about that. We are hurtling towards a global energy crisis for computation, and we're getting there way faster than you think.
Okay, but it's not like you can just pack up a data center and ship it to orbit. It's not that easy. Moving to space introduces two absolutely enormous engineering challenges that had to be cracked before any of this was even possible. We're talking about a totally different way of thinking about building things.
So hurdle number one is heat, a big one. Here on Earth, if your computer gets hot, a fan kicks on. Simple. But in the vacuum of space, there's no air to blow, so that's out. The only way to get rid of heat is to radiate it away as thermal energy. And to cool a monster chip like an H100, you can't just slap a little heat sink on it. You need a massive radiator, way bigger than you'd probably guess. If you don't have it, that chip will literally cook itself to death.
So, how big are we talking? Get ready for this. StarCloud's plan for a full-scale data center. It calls for a solar and cooling array. That's about 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers. Let that sink in. 4 by 4 kilometers. That's not a satellite anymore. That is basically a piece of real estate floating in orbit.
And just to give you some perspective on that number, think about the International Space Station, right? The single biggest thing we've ever built in space. Its solar arrays are just 0.005% of the size of what we're talking about here. This is a scale of engineering that is completely, utterly unprecedented. And that, of course, leads to the second giant problem. How on earth do you build something like that? You can't exactly send an astronaut out with a socket wrench to piece together something the size of a small city. And our old ways of doing things, using robotic arms, they're just way too slow, way too expensive for something on this massive a scale. The solution is something straight out of science fiction. A company called Rendezvous Robotics came up with this brilliant system of tiles. They're autonomous and they assemble themselves. So you launch them all packed up in a tight bundle. Then, once they're in orbit, they just unfurl. They use electromagnets to connect to each other, and the whole thing builds itself into this multi-kilometer array. It's really less like construction and more like watching a crystal grow in 0G. So, okay,
They figured out the engineering, but what's the end game here? What's the big vision? Because this isn't really about just launching one satellite, or even a few. This is the blueprint for a whole new type of global infrastructure, something they're calling an orbital compute fabric.
And they are not wasting any time. The scaling plan is incredibly aggressive. StarCloud 2 is set to launch in 2026 with 100 times the power, carrying NVIDIA's next-gen Blackwell chip. After that, StarCloud 3, a 2-ton beast, will be deployed by SpaceX's Starship. And get this, they won't launch one at a time. Starship is designed to release them in batches, kind of like a giant Pez dispenser in space. The ultimate goal? A massive mesh of tens of thousands of these satellites, all linked together to form one single planet-sized computer.
And how do you connect all these pieces together? Well, that's where laser interconnects come in. It's best to think of them like fiber optics, but without the actual fiber cable. In the pure vacuum of space, a beam of light can travel perfectly. There's no signal loss, no interference. It's a network that's cleaner, faster, and way more direct than anything we could ever dream of building down here on the ground.
Now here's where things got really interesting, economically speaking. There's this quote from StarCloud's CEO that just totally flips the script. You'd think the most expensive part of all this would be the rockets, right? Or maybe those gigantic self-building radiators. But nope. He says, by far the most expensive part of all this is the chips.
And that one quote tells you everything you need to know about their business model. They call it utilities first economics. See, StarCloud isn't trying to be a computer company. They're a utility company. They provide the essentials, the constant power from the sun, the perfect cooling from the vacuum, the connectivity. Then partners like NVIDIA come in and provide the actual GPUs, the really expensive part. So in a way, StarCloud is selling the real estate, the perfect environment of orbit, and NVIDIA brings the brains to live there.
But of course, whenever you have an idea this big, this revolutionary, you're not going to be alone for long. StarCloud's successful test didn't just prove a concept was possible. What it really did was fire the starting pistol on an entirely new kind of space race, a race for computational dominance.
And just look at who's jumping into the ring. You've got Jeff Bezos, who's a true believer in space-based data centers. You've got SpaceX itself, obviously, exploring the space. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, is in the game, acquiring launch companies to get Google's chips up there. There are even companies planning data centers on the moon. The money from the biggest tech companies on the planet is now pouring into the launch infrastructure to make all this happen. This is the new battlefield.
And all of this brings us to the real takeaway here. For the last 10, 15 years, the big tech race was all about who could build the fastest chip. That was the game. But that's not the game anymore. The real question isn't which chip is faster. The real question is, who controls the orbital infrastructure that powers our future?
If you liked the video, subscribe, leave a like, comment on what you liked most, and share the video. Thanks for watching.